there's 500,000 hectares of common grazings in Scotland. Now that's 6% of the whole of Scotland.
But we couldn't keep what we have if it wasn't for the grazings, the hill grazings, the common grazings. Couldn't do it.
I don't think there's an awful lot of people that actually understand what common grazings are, what they do, how they're made up.
Common grazings is the backbone of crofting.
Common grazings are the engine room where large numbers of stock are grazed in the crofting counties. Common grazings enable in-by land to be kept stock-free so silage or hay can be made. This increases the biodiversity by providing habitat for species like corncrake.
If the common grazings don't produce as much as they've been producing over the years, these lowland finishers are relying on the livestock coming from the hill areas to purchase and finish for the meat industry.
And that's the difficulty, that there are so few now actually using the land and managing the land.
There's many common grazings that are no longer used.
If the common grazings are not being used, then the people are not getting an income from the land, and therefore they're going to go elsewhere.
There needs to be some element of profit. We've lost so much over the last few decades. You do get to the point of worrying about, if the numbers keep losing, do we lose the critical mass to just contain some of these bigger areas?
Even SNH say that could have negative impacts on the biodiversity, because you would lose the mosaic that's managed by grazing, and that there could be scrub coming in.
Common grazings are only as good as the people involved.
It is very heavy work keeping livestock in this area. The lack of young people threatens the long-term viability. So there is a concern about whether the sheep will actually be able to stay here. I fear the only biodiversity management tool available to us, which is the crofter sheep, is going to be lost.
Creed, look back. Go away, go away. Wait, wait. Up, up. Come on, walk. Walk. Up. Come on. Come here. Callum, you and Ryan want to kind of head that way. I'm going to try and push these over for the while. Away here. Come back here. Blood. Get back here. Away. 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 Get back. Get back. Get back. I don't care if a sheep doesn't come in today, just to have a rest. Is your heart gonna kill?
Huh? It's yours?
No.
You don't have a heart?
Crofting is very much something that I do because I want to do it. I'm not making any money out of it. I like being involved with the animals, I enjoy it. Keeps you fit physically, mentally.
Being worked together on a communal basis in quite a lot of the communities in Skye anyway. It's keeping communities together, working together. Maybe that's diminishing a little bit, but it's still There's still that community spirit among the locals, I would say.
It's also a method of integrating new crofters into the community, passing on of skills and knowledge.
If you think of livestock production as a pyramid, the common grazings produces store animals, which then are sold to farms further south in Scotland. So the good foundation stock of sheep and cattle comes from the hill.
It's producing good quality meat and an asset really to the Scottish food industry. Mm-hmm. If they're properly managed and worked, they provide a source of income to the members in the group. Money coming into the common will more than likely be spent in the local area, like local builders, feed suppliers, shops, fuel.
There's a huge spin-off from common grazings for tourism. Tourists come to Scotland to see the landscape. A lot of the landscape, certainly in the west and the north, consists of common grazings.
The Trotternish Ridge is an iconic, famous landscape. Many films have been shot here.
They also love to see sheep. It's amazing the number of people that when they see sheep being gathered with sheepdogs, that they're out taking pictures, that cars stop and they're out filming it, and they just think it's so marvellous that it's a real privilege to see something like this.
It's also important from a European perspective when it comes to biodiversity, because it's got so much designated sites and a lot of species-rich grassland.
Even if you're not a botanist, a huge range of different textures, so that means a huge range of species.
Before, everything revolved around the common grazing and the approach of working together. Everybody went at one gather, everybody in the township were there. There were regular township meetings run in all the crofting townships, but not so much now.
When I first started going out gathering in Cruhy, there was over 40 people involved.
Now there are 2 or 3 go out. There are fewer sheep, but nonetheless the same ground has to be covered.
But he only gathered them today from in at the hollow. And on another day we take from that hollow that way, and then that bowl area, that curry, so that's another day.
Because of the challenges that ground has, you're often gathering over large areas for maybe not that many sheep.
People now relying on employment out with the local areas. Some working in oil rigs, some working just 20-30 miles away from home, leaving early in the morning and coming home late at night. So they've got very little time to put aside for township work, like gathering and just basically doing things around the township as a group. So a lot of people are doing their own thing that they can manage before and after work.
Well, am I glad to get them in. Oh, look at that, that's miles.
When you go through the gates and that fence, you come to it's what we call the Staff and General Hill. And the Staff and General Hill, we're entitled to graze our stock there. But so are, I think, about another 15 townships anyway. Vast, it goes right up to the Trotternish Ridge.
2.5, 3 miles wide by something like 7-8 miles long. Your sheep are out there all the time and then hefted onto a particular part of that general grazing.
See you next summer.
See, the blackface sheep are hardy. They look after themselves better than the cross sheep.
Some people will do another dosing in November.
Well, we do another dose in November.
And then another one in January.
Yeah.
And then some folk tip on dose in March. And then you go into June, then you start marking the lambs, ear marking,
Alright.
and castrating, and then you're into shearing all the ones that don't have lambs. And then after that you're into shearing all the ones that do have lambs. So
Bring them in again, go out again, and then they'd come in again, and then back out again.
You're talking about 5 times a year.
I think 4 is more realistic.
4 is more like it now.
Over time, the numbers of people fit and well to go out on the hills has declined considerably.
I'm getting old now, you know. It takes a fair bit of physical exertion to gather your sheep off the general hill. Even although we all have quad bikes now, you know, and hopefully we've all got half decent dogs. You can do a certain amount, but you still end up walking and going through, and it's hard going sometimes, you know. It's a younger man's game, that. So it's like me, you get older, you maybe think, well, I'll have it a wee bit easier. I'll have some more cross sheep, but not so many blackface sheep.
You know, maybe the members getting older, wanting to come out of it, and nobody actually coming behind them to go into it and take over their share. There's very few young folk coming in. You know, there is the young folk here and there, but not like the way it used to be. Even sheepdog clubs now, it seems to be, you know, they hire boys in to go gathering, and you don't actually see that many members of the sheepdog club at the facts. It's all kind of hired labour.
If you pay gatherers to come in, if they don't know the drill, you might as well not have them.
There's also a shortage maybe of skilled people. A lot of the times these gathers, they're having to be done at the time that everyone else is needing to gather. If, for example, everyone's trying to get their lambs to the same sale date. You can't rely on a small group of people because they can't be in 2 places at once. It's a really difficult time for young people because when you're early in your career, that's when you really need to be pushing hard at that. And when you're an apprentice, you can't really say, oh, I'm going gathering, or I might not be going gathering. That flexibility is very difficult in employment.
They'll phone around and say, right, we'll go. It might be even decided on a morning if the weather's good, you know. You're right, we're going to the hill today, right, we'll go. It's got a good day, right, we'll go. You know, you can't just say, well, we're going to do it in the 10 days hence, because 10 days hence it might be, you know, howling gale and driving rain, you just couldn't do it, you know. To be flexible.
We're very fortunate on Skye as the young crofters are very enthusiastic.
Cobalt bolus they're getting, that's the wee pill. It's just a supplement that they get, and then we'll just give them the...
But it's about how to maintain that enthusiasm and make sure that they take part and get involved. There's a lot of potential and there's a lot of skills. At our grazing committee meetings, there's definitely a fear that those skills are not being passed on in this area.
Financial point of view as well, if it's not going to be making money, the subsidies aren't going to be there. If there's going to be penalties and if there's going to be input from SNH and RSPB, then it's going to be harder to make a living unless people are going to be wanting to get involved in it. For example, if you reintroduce a sea eagle, if you tell people they're not allowed to graze certain areas because there might be a triple SI or not allowed to do something, and they're all sort of obstacles that are going to put people off from crofting.
It's all right for someone like me and for an awful lot of the crofters who, as I say, aren't depending on crofting to feed their families. If you were, things would be different.
If government want crofters to manage the grazings, they need to pay for it.
And I think when it comes into terms of policy and, you know, grant aid and funding and things like that, common grazing always seems to be the last thing that people think of.
There are 3 regions for subsidy payments. Region 1 is permanent pasture. Regions 2 and 3 are hill ground. The higher payment, Region 2, went to ground that carried more stock in the past.
The most important thing with regions for common grazings that maybe Edinburgh don't understand is that everyone has a share in every field of a common grazing. So the land classification for this is very important to a common grazing.
Better the ground, the more money you get. So our ground up here is very poor and we get very little money. But we now will get a payment, well I would, but like the people that claim a grant for off the hill, the lambs from this year, you'll get a headage payment for each lamb you keep and to bump up your overall payment because you're getting such a little payment from the hill.
It's a bit silly because it means that it all counts on the youngest, most fragile sheep surviving, and on bad years they don't survive so well. So, whereas if it was it's a lot of effort of extra stress.
The only crofters that would be entitled to this lamb scheme are those who have 80% or more of their land in category 3, in other words, rough grazing. If they have a fairly large percentage in category 2, which would be the in-by land, then they won't qualify. The difficulty is that there are lots of shareholders who do not make use of the grazings. So what the active crofter needs to do is to speak to those shareholders who are not making use of the land and to get their agreement to use their share. Then that's one way of building up the percentage of category 3 ground.
Under the crofting regulations, you would think that the committee itself could do that, but actually for government subsidy purposes, then you need to get the agreement of the shareholder and the committee needs to approve it. The snag is some of these shareholders, we can't get hold of them. Some of them would be too nervous to sign anything because they'd be worried they'd lose their share forever rather than for a year. If you were unfortunate and your sheep didn't do well that year, the person who's doing absolutely nothing but has a share would be more profitable than you who are gathering over the common grazings. And some people find that unpalatable.
They also have to make payments for the management of biodiversity.
More support for when common grazings are wanting to apply for things like environmental management, because there's extra paperwork involved with being a common grazings for doing an EECS plan. For example, in the guidance, you have to get the written consent of the majority of the shareholders within the common grazings to agree to the plan and also to agree to how the monies are divvied up. And then what you need to do is the clerk needs to have this letter going out to everyone with the guidance notes, and then a form a bit like this would need to be filled in with each of the names of the shareholders and to get them to all sign and explain what size of shares they have. So this is all extra paperwork and bureaucracy that is part of this EECS application for common grazings only, but there's no actual extra grant support for common grazings compared to a similar sized hill farm, which is much simpler because you're only dealing with maybe one grazier, whereas there's over 30 shareholders and over 90 shareholders in the other one. So it does become a much more complex, and that tends to be a limiting factor to people wanting to start to even think about applying for agri-environment. It's a voluntary post, and sometimes the extra paperwork and burden that's required is maybe part of the reason why a lot of committees aren't in office that used to be.
I think there needs to be an understanding that they are difficult to understand and they're difficult to administer because of their nature, which is, you know, a common shared area of land. I can quite understand why people don't understand it. To be brutally honest, I don't fully understand it. something I work on every day.
For the shareholders to decide whether it was a good idea to go into an agri-environment scheme, first of all, the ground would need to be audited, and if it is designated, there would need to be reference made to the site condition monitoring and whether the site was seen to be favourable or unfavourable condition.
Site condition monitoring or common standards monitoring is a requirement by the government for us to monitor the condition of the SSSIs, Sites of Special Scientific Interest, and for each habitat in the UK they've got a set of criteria, and you've got to pass or fail the habitats within each SSSI on these criteria.
Once you know what's on the ground, then you can look and see what options fit the habitats there are, and then try and work out a forecast of what the annual payments would be. Then it would be a normal time to have a meeting with the committee to go over what the pros and cons, the income, the restrictions, and what management they would need to do for the money. Then they would need to decide whether they wanted to go ahead. And then you have to do a management plan for that as well and describe where the animals are and things like that. And then we would have to then make a formal application with drawing up full maps, full description of the habitats as they are, and just put in which options and where, and do a diffuse pollution plan as well.
The main thing of standing in the way is getting the group together initially.
Instead of just saying, oh, there's one flock and one cattle herd working this ground, you've actually got to find out how myriad people manage their sheep and cattle throughout the whole grazing season, throughout the year.
And then coming up with the funds to apply for an application.
If they get an agent in, then there's the financial cost of the agent, and there needs to be, for these complex sites, there needs to be a wee bit more clarity beforehand, before people waste all that time and energy. Some common grazings have got extra layers of complexity that not even every common grazings has. For example, the large number of shares, because they're not common grazings, they're general grazings. So the villages themselves have their own common grazings, and then several villages have combined use of that larger general grazings. That's an administratively complex issue. And then on top of that, because they have large areas within the Trotternish Ridge, SAC and SSI, that's environmentally complex to deal with. At the moment, these shareholders, despite working in very difficult ground that is designated, get absolutely no financial reward for that because of the complexity of trying to work out what the right grazing levels are for the mosaic of the different habitats that are in that grazings.
If grazing was removed from the Trotternish Ridge, that is actually as bad as overgrazing. If there was no grazing, one or two dominant plant species would outcompete all the other plant species, and you'd end up with a very poor grassland, only with a few species present.
2,300 sheep were put off, and there was a lot of the townships didn't have muirburn in the plan. So what happened was the sheep always graze on the green up at the top, or the nice short green grass. That's where she preferred to go. So the lower slopes got more rank and unpalatable. Then the sheep don't like staying lower down and tend to stay higher up on the top.
This means you cannot just look at the sheep numbers for the common grazings as a whole.
Heather grows in the peat. Now, a little heather is good.
What sustains them through the frosty weather and the snowy weather.
But if the heather is left too long, it becomes old and woody.
Unpenetrable for even visitors or tourists to get through. It spoils the accessibility.
So part of the management should be sensible burning of the heather. But if there are only 2 or 3 shareholders actually taking part in the grazings, that can't be done safely.
Especially once it's been burnt, the heather ground, they like that. But they prefer that to this when it's been burnt, you know. If you do it in a controlled way, it's like to do it properly is tricky, it's a lot of work.
Having a good mix of cattle and sheep on here would be the way to deal with it. But at the moment, almost no cattle and not really sufficient sheep.
Because common graziers regions were set on an average basis rather than an individual business level, this can have some strange effects. Shareholders who are quite heavily stocked with cattle, but due to averagings with neighbours, have Region 3 classified shares. Because there is no equivalent of the ewe-hog scheme for hill calves, then these herds are less supported. This may have negative consequences for hill cattle numbers.
In Trottenish there's a large variety of different habitats. So you've got the species-rich grassland that's found at the bottom of the cliffs. You've got the Nardus grassland that isn't so species-rich, and then you've got the wet heath areas, and those are the 3 broad habitats that are present in Trottenish.
So it gets difficult to decide what is the most appropriate grazing for the site as a whole, because obviously the mosaic is so intricate you couldn't fence any areas off to manage for each one particularly, so you have to decide what's the best overall. The other big challenge is that the site condition monitoring for some of the features is quite old, so despite the fact that the JHI ecologists were out surveying as part of this, there's still quite a few question marks about what the actual habitat condition of the ground is.
So this here is my most species-rich plot yet. It's had 42 species in it.
So passes on those. So it fails on the height, but arguably it take a lot to grow tall in this kind of habitat. 2 of the acid grassland sites failed the site condition monitoring and 2 of them passed. However, the 2 that passed I consider much more dull and much more less worth, less biodiversity value than the 2 that failed. And I think this is a problem with site condition monitoring generally. It's not flexible enough to deal with different localities very easily. So the ones higher up are always going to be shorter because of the effects of climate. So when you're using site condition monitoring, you've got to remind yourself that it's not a be-all and end-all. You've got to take the results and then interpret them afterwards. You have a very simple set of rules that a feature, as it's called, has to pass before you can declare it in good health, in good condition.
So according to SNH, that's too grass dominated. It's therefore failing. Quite how you get it back to more than 33% falls, I'm not sure. The vegetation is very, very short, and one of the criteria is that at least 25% of it should be over 5 centimetres tall. And I don't think that's happening here.
My biggest issue with it is as you go up the hill, the vegetation gets shorter as the climate gets worse. But the rules stay the same about passing a certain amount above a certain height.
So the problem is that whilst we've decided that sheep are important, nobody's decided whether the sheep grazing is correct or it needs to be modified. But whilst that uncertainty continues, the graziers can't actually decide whether or not to take part in the environmental scheme. There's an impasse. What might happen, and my big fear, is that if over time it doesn't make sense from all the other points of view to keep sheep there, and there's not any support for the environmental management that the sheep are there, that the sheep will just come off the ground. And once you've taken sheep off that ground, you've lost the unique culture, you've lost the animals' own knowledge about the ground and their hefts, and you would, since it's thought that sheep are an important part for maintaining these Europeanly important habitats, that means that you've lost your only grazing and biodiversity tool that you have. So that's why I think that the pressure's on to actually try and get the shareholders supported for the work that they're doing, because it will not be easily or cheaply replaced once it's gone.
SNH has somehow or other got a bad name with crofters, unfairly so, and that's partly because there seems to be a superiority approach by certain of these bodies, and on the other side the very inferiority approach by crofters, who should, you know, take matters into their own hands more and actually work with these bodies. There's a tendency in the Highlands of Scotland, I suppose it's historical, to do what you're told rather than to get involved in actually developing policies.
It's how to utilise common grazings in that they become a viable and meaningful community benefit.
It would be far better if more people understood the way that these work and how important they are to the crofting areas and people.
The difficulty is actually trying to find a solution that will be able to be implemented quickly enough.
Mud boots on the ground. I think that's the way forward.
How do you get the people that are passionate about it involved in common grazings?
I think there needs to be a bit more development of grazings committees through some form of help.
It's a really important community development vehicle, and compared to maybe new community enterprises, the common grazings really don't get that supported.
There should be money for promoting sheepstock clubs, things like that, to get a group of people engaged and working together on the commons.
There's multiple untapped opportunities in common grazings.
Those grazings that don't have a committee or a clerk, or some of them aren't used at all.
Lack of young blood simply because inactive crofters are not making that land available for people who would love to have it. Part of the croft is the share in the common grazing, and if they are not cultivating or allowing that part to be cultivated, then they're in breach of their duties.
If common grazings became far more integral part of when any new policy is considered, and when the Scottish Government is commissioning research into the effects of proposed new policies, I think it's important that case studies that include common grazings are done at an early stage, and also when there's consultations out to the farming sector, that the common grazings are part of the consultation. That will mean that it'll at least not have any unseen negative implications for users of common grazings.
Have some kind of apprenticeship scheme where they might be able to get a young crofter involved and maybe train them how to handle livestock or fence or maintain the land, or could it be to put up better control fences so that they can target stock in specific areas on the grazings rather than having them roaming over such a large area.
Encourage people to stay on in these areas rather than heading off to the cities as soon as their school education is complete. We've got depopulation of the Highlands happening now.
Common grazings gives a lot of economic advantages, and it can actually give a lot more.
I'm missing always, Camillon Hachinas a Joey, Canada's Joey Havani. Agus Kumelasul a Hofjur, Hanen, Agus and Hautje, but behouden Yavi Kumelas as a Yogunya Vijeshale.
Swisha
Oops, that one escaped. Just now, sir. What? As you said, they follow each one another.
Yeah. Like teenagers.